3 days before my wedding, I found the texts. Instead of canceling, I kept smiling, kept planning, and kept my finger on the trigger waiting for the perfect moment to destroy him in front of everyone he loved. The ballroom shimmered with crystal chandeliers and white roses, each petal perfectly positioned as if the universe itself had conspired to create this moment of pristine beauty. Emma stood at the entrance in her ivory gown, the silk cascading down her body like water made solid, and she felt nothing but the cold certainty that had settled in her chest 3 days ago. Her father squeezed her arm gently, mistaking her trembling for nerves, not understanding that what coursed through her veins was something far more potent than anxiety. She had spent 72 hours crafting the perfect response to betrayal, and now, as the string quartet began the processional, she was ready to deliver it. The discovery had been almost laughably cliché, the kind of thing that happened in bad television dramas that she had always scorned for their lack of imagination. She had borrowed Marcus's laptop to print their honeymoon itinerary because her own computer had crashed. And there it was, left carelessly open, a text thread with someone named Victoria. The messages scrolled back months, filled with the kind of explicit content that left no room for misinterpretation, punctuated by photographs that made Emma's stomach turn. But what struck her most wasn't the betrayal itself, it was the casualness of it. The way Marcus had written, "Can't wait to see you." Thursday, on the same day, he told Emma he was working late on the Henderson account. She had sat there for an hour, maybe more, reading through the entire history while her world quietly rearranged itself into a new and uglier configuration. Victoria was a colleague from his firm, someone he'd mentioned occasionally in passing, always dismissively, always as if she were merely a piece of office furniture. The affair had started 6 months ago, right around the time they'd sent out the save the dates, and had continued through the cake tastings, the seating arrangements, the registry selections. Emma had been building a life while Marcus had been building a lie, and the symmetry of it almost impressed her with its audacity. Her first instinct had been to confront him immediately, to scream and throw things and demand explanations that wouldn't satisfy anything except his need to feel less guilty. But something had stopped her, some cold and calculating part of herself that she hadn't known existed until that moment. She had closed the laptop, printed her itinerary, and spent the next hour staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, watching her face rearrange itself from devastation to determination. By the time Marcus came home that evening, she had made her decision, and when he kissed her hello, she kissed him back with a smile that felt like a knife. The next 3 days had been the most difficult performance of her life, requiring every ounce of acting ability she'd cultivated in high school drama and later abandoned for more practical pursuits. She had continued with the wedding preparations, confirming the florist, approving the menu, practicing her speech for the reception. Marcus had noticed nothing amiss, too absorbed in his own deceptions to recognize hers, and she had marveled at how easy it was to fool someone who believed you trusted them completely. She had even made love to him the night before the wedding, letting him whisper promises about their future while she mentally reviewed her plans for destroying it. Her maid of honor, Claire, had sensed something during the rehearsal dinner, pulling Emma aside between the appetizers and entrees to ask if everything was all right. Emma had blamed her distraction on wedding jitters, on the overwhelming nature of committing one's life to another person, and Claire had accepted this explanation with a sympathetic hug. Nobody questioned the bride's nervousness, which made it the perfect camouflage for what Emma was actually feeling, a rage so pure and focused that it felt almost like peace. She had gone home that night and stayed up until 3 a.m, perfecting the final details of her presentation, making sure every transition was smooth, every piece of evidence irrefutable. Now, as she walked down the aisle toward Marcus, She saw him waiting at the altar with tears in his eyes, and she wondered if those tears were real or if he'd learned to fake emotion as skillfully as he'd learned to fake fidelity. He looked genuinely moved as she approached, his expression a mixture of love and awe that would have broken her heart a week ago. Today it simply reinforced her resolve, reminding her why exposure had to be public, had to be devastating, had to match the scale of his betrayal. She reached the altar and took his hands, feeling them warm and slightly damp against her cold fingers. And she smiled at him with all the love she'd once felt and now weaponized. The ceremony proceeded with the predictable rhythm of all weddings. The efficient speaking words about love and commitment that felt like satire under the circumstances. Emma said her vows with perfect sincerity because they were true in a way that Marcus would only understand later. Her promise to honor him in the manner he deserved. When it came time for Marcus to speak, she listened to him pledge his eternal faithfulness and felt almost sorry for him, knowing that his words would be replayed in everyone's memories against the backdrop of what was coming. The officiant pronounced them married. Marcus kissed her with enthusiasm, and they turned to face their 200 guests as husband and wife. For what Emma knew would be less than an hour, the reception hall sparkled with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized all their wedding planning. Each table adorned with arrangements of peonies and garden roses that had cost more than Emma's first car. The guests mingled and congratulated them, commenting on how beautiful the ceremony had been, how perfect they were together, how their love was clearly meant to last forever. Emma accepted their well wishes with grace, all while keeping one eye on the AV technician she'd hired, watching him set up the projection equipment that Marcus assumed was for the standard wedding slideshow of childhood photographs. Her parents looked proud, his parents looked satisfied, and everyone looked completely unsuspecting of what was about to unfold. Dinner was served in courses, each plate a small masterpiece that Emma couldn't taste through the adrenaline coursing through her system. She made conversation with the guests at the head table, laughing at jokes and posing for photographs, playing the role of blissful bride with the skill of someone who'd had 72 hours to rehearse. Marcus kept reaching over to squeeze her hand, to whisper how happy he was, how lucky he felt, and each time she squeezed back and whispered agreement. She wondered if Victoria was thinking about him right now, if she knew he'd gone through with the wedding, if she expected him to leave Emma after a respectable interval, or if she was content to remain the permanent other woman. The best man speech was appropriately amusing, filled with stories about Marcus's college years that painted him as charming and slightly roguish, but ultimately decent. Emma laughed in all the right places, watching Marcus's friends toast to his happiness while remaining oblivious to the fact that his happiness was built on systematic deception. Claire's maid of honor speech was more emotional, reminiscing about Emma's friendship and her joy at seeing her friend find someone who valued her. Emma felt a pang of guilt about what Claire was about to witness, knowing her friend would blame herself for not sensing something was wrong. But the guilt wasn't strong enough to stop what had already been set in motion. Then it was time for the bride's speech, and Emma stood up with her champagne glass raised, her heart pounding but her hands steady. The room quieted gradually, conversations tapering off as guests turned their attention toward the head table, expecting the usual expressions of gratitude and love. Marcus looked up at her adoringly, completely unaware that his entire life was balanced on the edge of a knife, about to tip into ruin. She smiled at the crowd, at her parents, at his parents, at all the people who had gathered to celebrate what they believed was a union built on trust and devotion. "Thank you all so much for being here today," Emma began, her voice clear and strong, carrying easily across the hushed room. "It means the world to us to be surrounded by the people we love most as we begin this new chapter of our lives together. Marriage is such a profound commitment built on honesty, faithfulness, and the belief that the person you've chosen will honor the vows they've made. She paused, letting the words settle, watching several guests nod in agreement, completely missing the edge beneath her pleasant tone. Marcus was beaming at her, probably thinking about how graceful she was, how lucky he was to have fooled her so completely. I want to take a moment to talk about trust, she continued, her smile never wavering. Trust is the foundation of everything, isn't it? Without trust, we have nothing but pretty words and empty promises. I trusted Marcus completely, never questioned where he was or who he was with, because that's what you do when you love someone. You believe them when they say they're working late, when they say they have business dinners, when they say you're the only one. Several people in the audience smiled, appreciating what they thought was a romantic testimony to their relationship, while Emma felt the power of what she was about to do coursing through her like electricity. So what I discovered just 3 days ago, that my trust had been misplaced. I had to make a choice, Emma said. And now her tone shifted slightly, enough that a few guests looked uncertain, glancing at each other. I could cancel the wedding, give back the gifts, disappoint all of you, and deal with this privately. Or I could do something else entirely. Marcus's smile had frozen on his face, confusion beginning to cloud his features as his brain struggled to process what he was hearing. The room had gone completely silent now, that special kind of silence that precedes disaster, when everyone senses something terrible coming but can't yet identify what form it will take. I chose to give Marcus the wedding he deserves, Emma said, and nodded to the IV technician. The lights dimmed slightly as the large screen behind the head table flickered to life, and Emma watched Marcus's face as he saw the first image appear. It was a screenshot of a text conversation, the words large enough to be read clearly by everyone in the room. Victoria's name at the top, followed by messages that left absolutely nothing to the imagination. A collective gasp rose from the guests as understanding dawned, followed by scattered exclamations of shock and disbelief. The presentation Emma had crafted was devastating in its thoroughness. A carefully organized timeline of Marcus's affair that laid out 6 months of betrayal in chronological order. Text messages appeared first, arranged by date, showing the progression from initial flirtation to explicit arrangement. Meet me at the hotel on Spring Street, room 406, on the same date as their engagement party. You're incredible. Can't stop thinking about last night, the morning after Marcus had told Emma he was too tired to make love. My fiancé is at a bridal shower. We have all afternoon. On the day Claire had thrown Emma her celebration. Each message was a small detonation, but together they formed a nuclear blast. Marcus had stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, his face cycling through shock, horror, and the beginning of panic. Emma, wait, this isn't let me explain, he stammered, but his voice was drowned out by the rising murmur of the crowd, people turning to their neighbors to confirm what they were seeing. His hand reached for hers, but she stepped back smoothly, keeping her eyes on the screen where photographs had begun to appear. Nothing pornographic, Emma had too much class for that, but images of Marcus and Victoria at restaurants, entering hotels, embracing in ways that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. The genius of Emma's presentation was its pacing. Each piece of evidence given time to register before the next appeared, building a case that couldn't be denied or explained away. There were screenshots of Marcus's credit card statements, hotel charges highlighted with dates that Emma had cross-referenced against his claims about working late. There were emails between Marcus and Victoria discussing Emma, calling her oblivious and trusting to a fault, laughing about how easy it was to maintain the deception. Emma had included Marcus's voice in some of the recordings, audio from videos that Victoria had apparently filmed, his distinctive laugh. His voice sang Victoria's name in ways he'd said Emma's name that morning. The room had erupted into chaos now. People standing, shouting questions, some guests moving toward the exits, while others pressed closer to see the screen better. Emma could see her mother's face, pale and shocked, her father beginning to rise from his seat with an expression that promised violence. Marcus's parents looked like they'd been struck, his mother actually swaying as if she might faint, while his father's face had turned a dangerous shade of red. Claire had both hands over her mouth, tears streaming down her face, while other bridesmaids clustered around her in confused solidarity. "Emma, please turn it off." "We can talk about this," Marcus begged, his voice cracking, reaching for the laptop that controlled the presentation. But Emma had positioned herself between him and the equipment. "There's nothing to talk about, Marcus. You made your choices, and now everyone gets to see exactly who you are." Her voice was still calm, almost conversational, which seemed to frighten him more than if she'd been screaming. The presentation continued relentlessly, now showing a calendar overlay that demonstrated how Marcus had been seeing Victoria at least twice a week throughout their engagement, maintaining his affair with the dedication most people reserve for hobbies. The evidence kept mounting, including receipts for jewelry that Emma had never received, hotel key cards collected with dates written on them in Victoria's handwriting, screenshots of social media posts that Victoria had made and quickly deleted. Emma had been meticulous in her investigation once she'd discovered the initial thread, spending 3 days barely sleeping as she documented everything she could find. She'd even hired a private investigator on an emergency basis, paying extra for rush service, and the professional had delivered photographs of Marcus and Victoria together just yesterday, giving her the final pieces of her presentation. One particularly damaging section showed side-by-side comparisons of what Marcus had told Emma he was doing on specific dates versus what he'd actually been doing. Working on the Henderson account appeared on screen, next to a photograph of Marcus and Victoria at a beach resort 3 hours away. Team dinner with the partners appeared beside a receipt from a romantic restaurant for two, wine and champagne for a celebration. Too exhausted to go to your cousin's wedding appeared next to photographs of Marcus and Victoria at a concert, his arm around her waist, both of them grinning. The final section of the presentation was perhaps the cruelest. A compilation of voice messages Victoria had left on Marcus's phone, presumably not knowing Emma would ever hear them. Victoria's voice filled the ballroom, breathy and confident, talking about how she couldn't wait until Marcus finally left that boring woman, and how they could stop pretending and be together properly. Another message had Victoria laughing about the wedding, saying, "At least the registry is good. We can use all that stuff when you're with me." The implications were clear. Marcus had planned to go through with the marriage while continuing his affair, perhaps indefinitely. As the final image faded, a simple text slide appeared. "I hope you all enjoyed the show as much as Marcus enjoyed his performance over the past 6 months. The bar is still open. Please enjoy the reception." Emma raised her champagne glass in a mock toast, took a long drink, then set it down carefully on the table. The room remained suspended in shocked silence for a moment longer before everything happened at once. Emma's father lunged toward Marcus with a roar of rage, being restrained by 2 groomsmen. Marcus's mother began sobbing loudly while his father started shouting demands for explanation. Guests were pulling out their phones, some filming, others texting. The news already spreading beyond the room. Emma turned to her maid of honor, who was staring at her with a mixture of horror and awe, and said quietly, "Claire, I'm going to need your help getting out of this dress." She began walking toward the exit, her head held high, her steps measured and deliberate despite the chaos erupting around her. Several guests moved aside to let her pass, some looking at her with sympathy, others with something like admiration, a few with judgment for the spectacle she'd created. She didn't care about any of it. She'd accomplished exactly what she'd set out to do. And the satisfaction was cold but real. Marcus was trying to follow her, calling her name, but he was immediately blocked by Emma's brother and father, who had broken free from the groomsmen restraining him. "You don't get to speak to her," her brother said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You don't get to go near her. You don't get to breathe the same air as her." Someone, perhaps one of the groomsmen who'd known about the affair or suspected it, was now receiving the crowd's hostility as people began to piece together who else might have been complicit in the deception. The wedding had transformed from celebration to tribunal in the space of 15 minutes in the bridal suite. Emma allowed Claire and 2 other bridesmaids to help her out of the wedding gown, each button and zipper a small liberation. She changed into the clothes she'd hidden earlier, jeans and a simple sweater, comfortable shoes suitable for the long drive she was about to take. Claire kept asking if she was okay, what she needed, how she could help, her voice thick with tears and disbelief. Emma hugged her friend tightly and whispered, "I'm better than I've been in 3 days. Thank you for being here, but I need to go now before the cops show up because Dad kills Marcus." She left through the service entrance with her pre-packed bags, which she'd stashed with the catering manager that morning, along with a generous tip for discretion. Her car was parked in a back lot, another detail she'd arranged in advance, and she drove away from the venue while chaos still reigned inside. Her phone began buzzing immediately with calls and texts, but she'd expected this, had even looked forward to it in a way. She let it buzz, driving in silence toward the airport and the flight she'd booked 3 days ago. Destination deliberately undefined, paid for with money from the joint account she'd emptied that morning. The affair had been expensive, not just emotionally, but financially. Marcus's hotels, dinners, gifts for Victoria, all of it charged to credit cards that were funded by the business he and Emma had been building together. She discovered that Victoria wasn't his first affair, just his most recent, and that pattern of betrayal had been subsidized by Emma's own work, her own contributions to their supposedly shared future. So she'd taken back what was hers, $50,000 from their savings, along with every gift his family had ever given her that had any resale value. The engagement ring, which had belonged to his grandmother, was in a safety deposit box with a note saying he could have it back if he apologized personally to every single wedding guest. Social media exploded within hours, which Emma monitored from her airport lounge with a glass of wine and a grim sense of satisfaction. Someone had filmed portions of the presentation and posted them, the video going viral with shocking speed, accumulating millions of views before the platform started taking it down for privacy violations. But the internet being what it was, the video kept reappearing, shared and reshared, downloaded and re-uploaded, taking on a life of its own beyond Emma's control or even interest. She read comments from strangers calling her a hero, a villain, a genius, a psychopath, and felt nothing but mild curiosity about how people projected their own experiences onto her. Story.Marcus tried calling 47 times before, apparently giving up or having his phone taken away by someone sensible. His messages ranged from apologetic to angry to desperate, a cycle that might have moved her once but now just seemed pathetic. "How could you do this to me, to us?" One text read, and Emma actually laughed out loud at the narcissism required to cast himself as the victim. Victoria had apparently also tried to reach her, a series of messages that Emma deleted without reading, uninterested in whatever justifications or explanations the other woman might offer. The affair had never really been about Victoria anyway, just about Marcus's character and the choices he'd made. Her parents were alternately furious at Marcus and worried about Emma. Her mother's messages begging her to come home. Her father's promising that Marcus would pay for this. Emma sent them a single text reassuring them she was safe and would be in touch soon, needing time alone to process everything. Several friends reached out with support, others with curiosity barely disguised as concern, wanting details and inside information they could share. She responded to none of them, protecting her privacy as fiercely as she'd exposed Marcus's secrets, understanding that her story was now public property, but her present didn't have to be. The legal implications were significant, as her lawyer had warned her during the consultation she'd sought 2 days before the wedding. Marcus could potentially sue for emotional distress, defamation if any of the information presented was false, even invasion of privacy for sharing his personal messages. But Emma had been careful, had documented everything meticulously, had ensured that every piece of evidence was genuine and obtained through means that, while perhaps ethically questionable, were legally defensible. She'd accessed only devices and accounts she had permission to use, had taken only photographs of things in plain view, had recorded nothing in states where such recording would be illegal. Her lawyer had been impressed by her thoroughness, even while advising against the public spectacle. But the spectacle had been the point, Emma reflected as her flight boarded. Private confrontation would have allowed Marcus to control the narrative, to spin the story to mutual friends, to paint Emma as overreacting or vindictive, perhaps even to convince people that the affair had been her fault somehow. Public exposure removed his ability to manipulate perception, froze the truth in place where everyone could see it, made him accountable in a way that private shame never would. She'd weaponized witnesses, turned their wedding guests into a jury that reached an immediate and unanimous verdict on his character. The week following the wedding was a strange blur of distance and disconnection. Emma watching her life implode from thousands of miles away through phone screens and secondhand reports. The story had been picked up by local news, then national media, with wedding revenge and bride's ultimate payback becoming trending topics. Think pieces appeared about public shaming, about whether Emma's response was justified or cruel, about the ethics of revenge in the age of social media. She read none of them thoroughly, skimming only enough to confirm that she'd achieved her goal of making Marcus's betrayal public and permanent. Marcus, according to reports from mutual acquaintances, had retreated to his parents' house and was not handling the attention well. His firm had placed him on administrative leave pending an investigation into his relationship with Victoria, since workplace affairs violated their ethics policy. Victoria herself had apparently quit, unable to handle the harassment and judgment from colleagues. Her own relationship with her fiancé now in ruins after he'd seen the evidence of her affair with Marcus. Emma felt no particular satisfaction about Victoria's suffering, understanding that the other woman had been complicit, but viewing Marcus as the primary architect of the betrayal. The wedding itself had dissolved into arguments and recriminations after Emma's departure. Guests taking sides, families blaming each other, friendships fracturing under the pressure of choosing loyalty. The venue had apparently kept the deposit given the unusual circumstances, and the catering bill had been paid, so at least that part was resolved. The gifts posed a more complex question, etiquette demanding they be returned since there was technically no marriage to celebrate. But Emma had left instructions with Claire to donate everything to a women's shelter, reasoning that the items might as well serve someone who actually needed them. Annulment proceedings were straightforward given that the marriage had lasted less than an hour and been based on fraud. Marcus's lawyer had argued against characterizing it as fraud, but the text messages Emma had preserved made his intent to continue the affair clear, establishing deception as the foundation of his vows. The judge handling the case had apparently been unimpressed by Marcus's arguments, ruling in Emma's favor on every contested point, including her right to keep the money she'd taken from their joint account. Marcus would be responsible for all wedding costs, all legal fees, and would face criminal charges if he attempted to contact Emma in any way. Emma spent 3 months traveling, watching her old life recede into the past like shorelines viewed from a departing ship. She went to places she'd always wanted to visit, but Marcus had dismissed as uninteresting or impractical. Hiking in New Zealand, exploring temples in Thailand, sitting in cafes in Prague. She was alone but not lonely, discovering that she preferred her own company to the performance of happiness she'd maintained throughout her relationship with Marcus. The betrayal had hurt, still hurt if she examined it too closely, but the freedom that followed felt like compensation of a kind. A chance to discover who she was outside the context of someone else's deceptions. Her phone continued to buzz with interview, requests from media outlets wanting to discuss her revenge, to turn her story into content that could be monetized and consumed. She declined all of them, unwilling to become a symbol or spokesperson for scorned women everywhere, wanting to be neither hero nor victim in anyone's narrative but her own. She changed her number eventually, keeping only a small circle of trusted friends and family who had the new contact information. The digital detox was liberating, removing her from the constant cycle of opinions and judgments about choices she'd already made and wouldn't reconsider. When she finally returned home 6 months after the wedding, that wasn't. She found that the story had faded from immediate attention, replaced by newer scandals and fresh outrages. People who recognized her sometimes gave her knowing looks or offered sympathetic comments, but mostly life had moved on, her moment of viral fame already feeling dated. She got a new job at a different company, started rebuilding her social circle, began the work of constructing a life based on her own desires rather than compromise partnerships. Therapy helped, giving her tools to process the betrayal without letting it define her. To understand her own choices without drowning in analysis. Marcus tried reaching out one final time a year after the wedding. A long email sent to her professional address since he had no other way to contact her. He'd apparently done his own therapy, processed his own guilt, and wanted closure or forgiveness or perhaps just absolution from the person he'd wronged. Emma read the email once, noted its tone of self-justification hidden beneath apologetic language, then deleted it without responding. She owed him nothing, not even acknowledgement, and his need for redemption wasn't her responsibility to fulfill. Some wounds didn't require reconciliation to heal, just distance and time. She dated eventually, though cautiously, finding it hard to trust new partners with the knowledge of what trust had cost her before. She was upfront about her history, the story being too public to hide, and watched carefully how potential partners reacted to it. Some were intimidated by the legend of her revenge. Others were attracted by it for reasons she found troubling. A few understood it as simply something that had happened to her rather than something that defined her. Those were the ones worth getting to know, the people who saw her as complex and complete rather than as a cautionary tale or an inspiration. The most unexpected consequence of her public revenge was the messages she received from other people, mostly women who had experienced similar betrayals. They wrote to her describing their own discoveries of infidelity, their own struggles with how to respond, their own desires for justice that seemed impossible to achieve. Emma responded to none of these messages directly, uncomfortable with the role of advisor or model, but she thought about them often, about how common betrayal was, how many people carried these wounds privately. Her choice had been extreme, undeniably so, but it had also been honest. A refusal to pretend that everything was fine when her entire foundation had been revealed as rotten. 2 years after the wedding, Emma ran into Victoria at a coffee shop, a coincidence that felt almost cosmic in its unlikeliness. They stared at each other for a long moment, years of history compressed into seconds of recognition. Victoria looked tired, older than she should have, and started to say something before apparently thinking better of it. Emma simply nodded, paid for her coffee, and left, feeling neither anger nor satisfaction, just a mild curiosity about how Victoria's life had unfolded after the exposure. She didn't look back, didn't wonder if Victoria might follow her. Didn't care about anything except the coffee in her hand and the afternoon stretching ahead. She never regretted her choice, though she sometimes wondered about the alternative paths she might have taken. Canceling the wedding would have been simpler, would have avoided the spectacle and public judgment, would have dealt with the betrayal privately as society expected. But it also would have allowed Marcus to control the story, to minimize his actions, to move forward with his reputation intact, while Emma bore the private burden of his betrayal. The public exposure had been nuclear, had destroyed any possibility of quiet resolution. But it had also ensured that Marcus faced real consequences for his choices, that his actions were witnessed and judged by everyone who'd been asked to celebrate his supposed commitment. The question of whether her revenge had been proportionate to Marcus's crime was one that Emma considered occasionally, with genuine curiosity rather than doubt. He'd deceived her for 6 months, had planned to marry her while continuing his affair, had laughed about her trust with his mistress, had spent their shared money on his betrayal. The humiliation he experienced at the wedding reception was public but temporary, eventually fading as new scandals emerged. The humiliation Emma would have experienced discovering the affair after the wedding, after vowing her life to him, after legally and financially binding herself to him more completely, would have been private but permanent, a secret shame corroding her sense of self. She built a good life in the aftermath, better than the one she'd been heading toward with Marcus, though she wouldn't have believed that possible during those first dark days after discovering his betrayal. She found work that challenged her, friends who valued honesty, eventually a partner who understood that trust was something earned and maintained rather than assumed. She traveled when she wanted to, made decisions based on her own preferences, slept peacefully without wondering if the person beside her was texting someone else. The wedding speech that had destroyed her marriage had also, paradoxically, saved her life from being lived under false pretenses indefinitely. Marcus's life had been harder, from what Emma heard through the inevitable gossip networks that persisted despite changed numbers and deleted social media. His career never recovered fully, the scandal having marked him professionally as well as personally. His relationship with Victoria had imploded within months of the exposure, neither of them able to bear the weight of having destroyed so much for something that turned out to be less real than either had believed. He'd moved cities eventually, started over somewhere his name didn't immediately trigger recognition, built a smaller life with fewer expectations. Emma felt neither pity nor pleasure at this information, experiencing it as simple facts about someone who no longer mattered to her present. The wedding video, her carefully crafted presentation of evidence, continued to circulate in various corners of the internet, periodically resurfacing whenever someone wanted to discuss revenge or betrayal or justice. Emma had learned to live with being a meme, her moment of calculated fury reduced to clips and screenshots used to illustrate points about relationship dynamics. She never watched the videos when they appeared, having no desire to relive that night or examine her younger self's choice to weaponize a wedding reception. She'd made her choice, executed it with precision, and moved on, understanding that internet immortality was beyond her control and ultimately irrelevant to her actual life. Her parents eventually stopped asking if she regretted the spectacle, recognizing that she'd processed the event and integrated it into her history without shame or second thoughts. Her father had initially been furious at the public nature of the exposure, worried about family reputation and social judgment, but had come to respect his daughter's refusal to suffer privately for someone else's sins. Her mother had been more understanding from the beginning, Having apparently had her own experiences with betrayal in youth, and had quietly supported Emma's choice even while publicly expressing appropriate shock. They'd rebuilt their relationship around mutual respect rather than protective concern, all three of them acknowledging that Emma was an adult capable of making difficult decisions. Claire remained her closest friend, having witnessed both the betrayal and its exposure, understanding the fullness of Emma's experience in ways others couldn't. They talked occasionally about that night, Claire admitting she'd been terrified watching Emma's speech, having no idea what was about to happen, but sensing the tension in her friend's controlled delivery. She'd thought initially that Emma might be pregnant or announcing some other surprise, the possibility of the revenge reveal never occurring to her until the first screenshot appeared. Her respect for Emma's planning and execution was mixed with horror at what the planning had cost. The 3 days of perfect performance, while Emma's world had already shattered privately, the question that strangers asked most frequently, when they recognized Emma or made the connection between her story and her face, was whether she'd do it again. The question annoyed her for its assumption that she spent time reconsidering choices already made, as if she maintained some running cost-benefit analysis of that night's decisions. But when pressed, she always answered honestly, yes. She would do it again because the alternative had been to swallow Marcus's betrayal privately, to cancel the wedding quietly, to protect his reputation while destroying her own peace. The public nature of her revenge had been necessary to create accountability, to ensure witnesses, to make certain that Marcus couldn't rewrite history or minimize his actions. She sometimes thought about the 200 guests who'd witnessed her wedding speech, wondering how that night had affected their own relationships. Had it made them more suspicious, less trusting, quicker to investigate doubts? Or had it made them more careful with their own fidelity, more aware of the consequences of betrayal, more committed to honesty? She'd received a few messages over the years from wedding attendees thanking her for exposing truths they'd needed to see, for giving them permission to demand accountability, for demonstrating that betrayed partners didn't have to accept victimhood quietly. Those messages meant something, validated her choice in ways that public opinion never could. Marcus had tried several times over the years to have the videos removed from the internet, citing privacy violations and emotional distress. He'd succeeded, occasionally individual posts disappearing after legal threats, but the videos always reappeared elsewhere, the internet being essentially impossible to scrub completely. Emma had mixed feelings about the permanence of his humiliation, recognizing that his ability to move forward was genuinely hampered by the continued circulation of his worst moment. But she also recognized that her own worst moment, discovering his betrayal while planning their wedding, had been private, and that public and private shame simply operated on different timelines and scales. The wedding dress still hung in her closet, preserved in its protective bag, a relic of a day that had meant so many different things. Emma kept it not as a shrine to her revenge, but as a reminder of her own strength, her ability to perform under impossible pressure, to plan meticulously while her world crumbled. She occasionally considered selling it or donating it, but something always stopped her, some sense that the dress belonged to that specific moment and couldn't be transferred to anyone else's story. It represented both her vulnerability and her vengeance. The costume she'd worn while destroying the man who destroyed her. Professional opportunities had emerged from the notoriety. Ironically enough, companies wanting to hire the woman famous for her strategic revenge for positions, requiring planning and execution under pressure. Emma had initially resisted trading on her personal tragedy, but eventually recognized that the skills she demonstrated were legitimately valuable, that her moment of calculated fury had showcased ability she could deploy toward more constructive ends. She built a career in crisis management, helping companies navigate disasters with the same meticulous attention to detail she had applied to exposing Marcus's affair. The work was satisfying in ways her previous job had never been, challenging her strategically while letting her help others. Through their worst moments, she spoke publicly about the experience exactly once. 3 years after the wedding, at a women's conference where she'd been invited to discuss resilience and recovery. She told the story factually, without embellishment or apology, describing both the devastation of discovering Marcus's betrayal and the cold certainty that had guided her response. The audience had been rapt, some horrified, some delighted, all clearly moved by the narrative's dramatic arc. But what Emma emphasized in her speech wasn't the revenge itself, but what came after. The rebuilding, the therapy, the gradual reconstruction of trust and hope. The wedding speech had been an ending, but it had also been a beginning. Clearing space for the life she actually wanted, rather than the compromise she'd been accepting. Questions from the audience had been intense and personal. People wanting to know details she wasn't willing to share, wanting permission or guidance for their own situations. Emma had been clear that she wasn't advocating for public revenge as a general strategy, that her choice had been specific to her circumstances and personality, that others needed to find their own paths through betrayal. But she also refused to apologize for her choice or diminish it to make others comfortable, understanding that her refusal to be victimized quietly had threatened certain narratives about how wronged women should behave. Her revenge had been loud when society expected silence, public when privacy was prescribed, and unapologetic when contrition was demanded. The speech had gone viral in its own right, clips appearing on social media with captions about empowerment and justice. Emma's words quoted and misquoted across platforms. She'd been amused by how selectively people heard her message, some taking only the revenge portion, others focusing only on recovery, few engaging with the full complexity of her experience. But that was humanity's nature, to simplify and categorize, to turn complex stories into digestible lessons. Emma had told her truth as completely as she could. What people did with it was beyond her control and ultimately beside the point. 5 years after the wedding, Emma married someone else in a small ceremony with 20 guests, mostly immediate family and closest friends. There were no speeches, no videos, no opportunities for spectacle or surprise. The event was quiet, intentional, built on years of demonstrated trustworthiness rather than assumptions and promises. Her new partner understood her history, respected the wounds that had made her cautious, never asked her to be less vigilant or more forgiving than felt authentic. Their relationship was built on transparency and consistent action, both of them understanding that trust was rebuilt slowly through accumulated evidence rather than demanded through vows. She rarely thought about Marcus anymore, his role in her life having faded to a historical footnote, relevant to understanding her journey, but no longer active in her present. She heard occasionally that he'd married someone else, had children, built a life that looked conventional from the outside. She felt nothing about this information, no jealousy or satisfaction, no curiosity about whether he'd learned anything or changed at all. That part of her life was complete, processed and integrated and released, taking up no more emotional space than any other finished chapter. The anniversary of her first wedding became, oddly enough, a day of personal celebration, marking the moment she'd chosen herself over social expectation, honesty over comfortable lies. She spent each anniversary doing something she loved, usually alone, reflecting on the distance she'd traveled from that night in the reception hall. Year 1 had been painful, too close to the trauma to feel anything but raw. Year 5 was contemplative, able to see patterns and growth. Year 10 would presumably bring its own perspective. Another vantage point from which to view the choice that had redirected her entire life, she wrote occasionally about her experience, essays that explored betrayal and trust and revenge without sensationalizing or simplifying. Her writing found an audience among people navigating similar situations, those trying to balance their desire for justice against social pressure toward forgiveness. Emma didn't prescribe solutions, recognizing that each situation required its own calculus, but she offered her own experience as a data point, evidence that choosing public exposure didn't preclude eventual peace. The writing was therapeutic in ways she hadn't expected, helping her understand her own motivations and consequences more clearly than she had in the moment of action. The most surprising legacy of her wedding speech was the scholarship fund she eventually established for women leaving marriages or relationships where they'd been betrayed or deceived. The fund helped cover legal costs, therapy expenses, relocation needs, all the practical costs of extracting oneself from a life built on lies. Emma funded it partially through her own earnings, partially through speaking fees, partially through donations from people who'd been moved by her story and wanted to help others in similar situations. The work felt like a productive channeling of the rage that had fueled her revenge, transforming destruction into construction, private pain into public support. Marcus had apparently heard about the scholarship fund and attempted to donate to it, presumably as some gesture of atonement or perhaps just to associate himself with something positive rather than being known only for his betrayal. Emma had rejected the donation immediately, unwilling to let him buy redemption or insert himself into her present in any way. The money had come from his deception. She wanted nothing built on that foundation. He'd seemed genuinely hurt by the rejection, according to the mutual acquaintance who delivered his response. Still not understanding, after all these years, that his feelings about his actions mattered less than the actions themselves, she dated more easily as time passed, the old wounds healing enough that she could approach new relationships with genuine openness rather than defensive vigilance. Not every relationship worked out, but that was true for everyone, not just people who'd experienced dramatic betrayals. She learned to distinguish between reasonable caution and self-protective sabotage, between red flags that deserved attention and anxieties that belonged to her past rather than her present. Therapy continued to help with this, giving her frameworks for understanding her own patterns and making conscious choices rather than reactive ones. The internet never forgot her wedding speech. The video continuing to circulate with periodic surges in attention whenever someone rediscovered it and shared it, with fresh outrage or admiration. Emma had long since stopped monitoring these cycles, secure enough in her choices that strangers' opinions held no power over her peace. She neither courted the attention nor fled from it, simply accepting that being mildly internet famous for revenge was part of her biographical details, like being tall or left-handed, notable but not DEFINITIONN, her parents aged. Her father developing health problems that reminded Emma how temporary everything was, how finite the time for holding grudges or maintaining performances. She was grateful she exposed Marcus's betrayal when she did, that she hadn't wasted years in a false marriage before discovering the truth, that she'd given herself the gift of decades to build something authentic instead. The older she got, the more she appreciated the ruthless efficiency of her younger self's response, the refusal to let social niceties override personal truth, the willingness to blow everything up rather than live in a structure built on lies. She sometimes wondered about Victoria, whether the other woman had found peace or happiness, or simply acceptance of her own choices. Emma bore her no particular ill will anymore, understanding that Victoria had been a symptom rather than the disease, that Marcus would have found someone else to betray her with if Victoria hadn't been available. The affair had never really been about Victoria being irresistible or Emma being insufficient. It had been about Marcus's character, his capacity for deception, his willingness to prioritize his own desires over his commitments. Understanding this intellectually hadn't eliminated the sting of Victoria's participation, but it had diminished it, relegated it to background, noise rather than primary wound. The wedding venue had apparently become something of a landmark after her speech. People requesting tours or asking to see the ballroom where the infamous exposure had occurred. Emma found this grotesque and slightly funny, the commodification of her pain into tourist attraction, but recognized that she'd forfeited control over the story's meaning when she'd made it public. The venue had eventually embraced the notoriety, offering revenge wedding packages that promised dramatic reveals and spectacular exits. Emma had no idea whether these were sincere offerings or marketing stunts. And either way, the irony was too perfect to be upset about. Professional success came easier than romantic success initially. Emma finding it simpler to trust colleagues than partners, to risk professional vulnerability than emotional openness. She built a reputation as someone who got results, who could navigate complex situations with strategic precision, who didn't crack under pressure. Her career became a source of genuine satisfaction, proving to herself that she could build something meaningful that wasn't dependent on or diminished by anyone else's actions. The money was good, the work engaging, the respect earned rather than assumed. All of it adding up to a life she'd chosen rather than one she'd compromised into. She returned to the wedding venue once, 10 years after her speech, driven by curiosity rather than nostalgia or grief. The ballroom looked different than she remembered, smaller somehow, less dramatic. Just a room with nice lighting and decent acoustics. She stood where she'd given her speech and felt nothing except mild surprise at how much power she'd invested in this space, how much weight this moment had carried. A decade had passed, she'd built an entirely different life, and this room was just a room again, stripped of its mythological significance. She took a photograph to mark her return, posted it nowhere, kept it as private proof of perspective and distance. The scars from Marcus's betrayal were still there, would perhaps always be there in some form, but they'd been integrated into the larger story of her life rather than dominating it. She was more cautious than she might have been without that experience, more attentive to inconsistencies and evasions, quicker to investigate doubts rather than suppress them. But she was also more confident in her own judgment, more willing to trust her instincts, more comfortable ending things that didn't serve her rather than enduring them out of obligation. Marcus's betrayal had wounded her, but her response to it had taught her that she could survive wounds. That survival could even lead to something better than what had been destroyed. Her second marriage remained strong, built on foundations that had been tested and proven rather than assumed and hoped for. Her partner had their own history of betrayal, understood the work required to rebuild trust, brought their own hard-won wisdom about honesty and vulnerability. They attended therapy together periodically, not as crisis intervention, but as maintenance, keeping communication clear and assumptions examined. It wasn't perfect, no relationship was, but it was real in ways Emma's engagement to Marcus had never been. Built on actual knowledge of each other rather than idealized projections. She had children eventually, a decision that required confronting fears about repeating patterns or passing on trauma. But Emma trusted herself enough by then to believe she could parent honestly, could teach her children about both trust and its limits, could model recovery rather than just displaying wounds. She told them age-appropriate versions of her story as they grew, not dwelling on it, but not hiding it either. Wanting them to understand that betrayal existed, but didn't have to define or destroy. They asked questions she answered honestly, and gradually she saw them developing their own sense of when to trust and when to verify, When to forgive and when to walk away. The wedding speech itself seemed almost quaint in retrospect, a product of a specific technological moment when public exposure was still relatively novel and shocking. The world had changed. Social media had become even more pervasive. Public shaming had become almost commonplace, and what had seemed dramatic in Emma's moment felt almost expected now. But the emotional core remained relevant. The question of how to respond to betrayal with integrity, how to balance justice and mercy, how to protect oneself without becoming consumed by vengeance. Emma's answer had been specific to her situation, but the question itself was eternal. She wrote a book finally 15 years after the wedding, a memoir that explored the full arc of her experience, from relationship to betrayal to exposure to recovery. The writing process was painful, requiring her to revisit events she'd processed and released, but also clarifying, helping her understand patterns she'd only intuited before. The book was honest about her own failings, the ways she'd ignored early warning signs, the performance she'd maintained during her engagement rather than examining her doubts. It was a success, not because people loved revenge, but because they recognized themselves in her struggles with trust and betrayal and self-deception. Marcus read the book apparently, sending a message through a lawyer asking if they could talk, if there might be some way to find closure or peace. Emma considered the request seriously before declining, recognizing that closure was something she'd already found independently, that talking to Marcus would serve his needs rather than hers. She didn't need his explanation or apology, didn't need to understand his motivations or forgive his choices, didn't need anything from him at all. That was perhaps the truest measure of her healing. The absolute indifference she felt toward the man who'd once been her entire future. The scholarship fund continued to grow, helping dozens of people extract themselves from relationships built on deception. Emma met some of the recipients, heard their stories, offered what support she could based on her own experience. Each person's situation was unique, requiring different strategies and solutions. But the underlying need for agency and dignity remained constant. Emma's contribution wasn't prescribing revenge, but affirming that leaving, exposing, refusing to protect betrayers were all legitimate choices. That niceness wasn't more important than honesty. That social comfort wasn't more valuable than personal peace. She gave speeches occasionally, always emphasizing that her choice had been hers alone, that what worked for her might not work for others, that revenge satisfied something in her but might leave others feeling empty. The nuance got lost sometimes in the retelling, people wanting either unqualified endorsement or complete renunciation of public exposure. But Emma held steady in the complicated middle, acknowledging both the satisfaction and the cost, the justice and the cruelty, the necessity and the excess. Life was complex, betrayal was complex, and responses to betrayal deserved to be evaluated as complexly as the situations that prompted them. The 20-year anniversary of her wedding speech arrived without fanfare. Emma, now firmly middle-aged, her life so different from that night that it felt almost like someone else's story. She watched the old video out of curiosity, seeing her younger self's careful control, hearing the edge in her own voice that she'd tried to keep smooth. That Emma had been brave and broken, strategic and suffering, powerful and wounded all at once. This Emma, 20 years later, was healed but scarred, wiser but warier, peaceful but prepared. The continuity between those two versions of herself was clear. The wedding speech, not an aberration, but an authentic expression of who she'd been and would become. Marcus had died 2 years earlier. Heart attack at 55, stress and poor lifestyle catching up with him. Emma had felt a complicated pang at the news. Not grief exactly, but recognition that the human being behind the betrayal was gone. that whatever potential for growth or redemption he might have had was now foreclosed. She didn't attend his funeral, didn't send condolences, maintained the boundaries she'd established 20 years earlier. But she did think about him for the first time in years, remembering not just the betrayal, but the good parts that had preceded it, the reasons she'd loved him before she'd hated him. The past was more complex than her revenge had acknowledged. Though the revenge had still been necessary, she retired from crisis management eventually, having helped enough people navigate their worst moments that she needed to step back and focus on her own peace. The work had been rewarding but exhausting, requiring constant engagement with drama and disaster that she no longer had the energy to sustain. She traveled more, spent time with her grandchildren, wrote occasionally, volunteered with organizations supporting domestic violence survivors. Life was quieter now, less dramatic, and she appreciated the steadiness of it. Having had enough drama to last a lifetime during those 3 days of discovering Marcus's betrayal and planning her response, the wedding speech remained her most famous moment, the thing she was known for regardless of everything else she'd accomplished. She'd made peace with that reality, understanding that one dramatic action often overshadowed decades of quieter achievements. But she also knew that the speech had changed her life trajectory, had given her the agency and confidence that shaped everything that followed. Without that moment of choosing herself over social expectation, she might have stayed with Marcus, might have discovered more affairs, might have wasted decades in escalating misery. The speech had been destructive, but it had also been liberating, clearing space for the life she actually wanted rather than the compromise she'd been accepting. Looking back across 30 years, Emma could trace the direct line from that wedding speech to the life she'd built. Each choice and consequence flowing from that moment of calculated exposure. She'd hurt Marcus, yes, had damaged his reputation and career, had chosen public humiliation over private grace. But she'd also saved herself, had refused to disappear into someone else's deception, had demanded accountability when forgiveness would have been easier. The choice had been harsh but honest, cruel but necessary, vengeful but ultimately protective. She'd been 28 years old, devastated and determined, and she'd made the best decision she could with the information and emotions available to her. If she could go back and advise her younger self, Emma wasn't sure what she'd say. Part of her wanted to suggest a less public response to spare that young woman the years of being defined by her revenge. But a larger part recognized that the public nature had been essential, that private confrontation would have lacked the accountability that made the exposure meaningful. She might suggest better self-care in the aftermath, more immediate therapy, less alcohol and travel as numbing agents. But the core choice, the decision to expose Marcus's betrayal publicly rather than suffer it privately, that she wouldn't change. It had been right for her, had honored her truth, had given her the foundation to build something better. The final section of her memoir, written 30 years after the wedding speech, was titled simply No Regrets. She'd chosen the title carefully, knowing it would be controversial, that people would read it as vindictiveness or lack of growth. But Emma meant it sincerely, without irony or defiance. She didn't regret exposing Marcus because the alternative had been complicity in her own deception, had been protecting his reputation while destroying her own peace. She didn't regret the public nature because private betrayal deserved public accountability, because silence protected wrongdoers while isolating victims. She didn't regret the drama because some situations required drama, required disruption, required the kind of spectacular explosion that left no room for minimization or revision. I was 28 years old, she wrote in the memoir's closing pages, and I just discovered that everything I believed about my future was a lie. I had 3 days before the wedding, 3 days to decide who I wanted to be in response to this betrayal. I chose to be someone who didn't suffer in silence, who didn't protect people who'd hurt her, who didn't value social comfort over personal truth. That choice shaped everything that followed, gave me a template for how to handle future betrayals and disappointments and challenges. I'm 60 now, looking back across 3 decades, and I still believe I made the right choice. Not the only choice, not the choice that would be right for everyone, but the right choice for me. And that's enough.